gamers in chat. Sorry, but distracted for a bit with some news from the VTubers community. Sucks, what happened to Iron Mouse? There's some justice being done over there. But in the meantime, to play as usual, reading letters. This time also, my mic is on. Replying to some strangers' letters as usual. Maybe hopefully help some people find some answers. To continue reading Manufacturing Consent. I haven't continued much after the last time I streamed Kind Words and read the book, because I've been reading other books instead. Yeah, so I thought since today also it's been one of those days that I got distracted so much, it's hard to focus, so I didn't really read any of the book that I'm supposed to read today, which is supposed to be this book, The Ministry of Time. I tried reading it and I only got through like 10 pages or so, and then I got distracted with a lot of things. I had a few extra jobs today, then I had to go to the gym, and then after that I just cannot focus at all on reading. So I thought, rather than forcing myself to read and then not getting any of the story, I thought, I'll just stream Kind Words and then read another book, because reading loudly might help me focus on the book compared to the usual reading. At least that's my thought. I could be wrong. Anyway, as usual, a sticker. Hey, lemonade, nice. I could use that. Another sticker. I think these are the replies from my last stream. Hey, a balloon. That's cute. Okay. As a reply to, as usual, 3 letters, read books, and then to take a break, I'll read another 3 letters, reply to 3 letters, and then read again some parts of the book. Hello, hola. I don't know what that means. I'm too lazy to get my phone. I'm sure it's a nice thing. I'll just trust it. My friend was persuaded by me, join Delta operation. I don't know what Delta operation is. For not getting in, came to play with him. Okay, I'll Google what Delta operation is. Game? Is it a game? There's a Delta Force. Sounds like it came from a very young person. It's people fighting for games, so you know, not exactly the most adult stuff to do, except if you haven't grown up after a certain age. rules of the game. I think it's fair. Seru. Get the balloon, I know. Oh, so. You made me happy, I hope you are too. Chips to me. And your heart out and give us a piece of yourself as well as kindness and total strength. Everyone has a very self state. That doesn't really make me answer, so. What the dream of Elizabeth? As a pioneer. Yes, it is not a good thing when people go to my thing and tell me and taking this thing like it and doesn't work stuff. Okay, that's also doesn't only reply. all I can give. Personal platform, clear. I connect from writing cities and creepy. Maybe top. Someone sent me that today. Okay. Start reading. Let me get rid of my water so I can get my book closer. I remember why I haven't read this again. Look at those fonts. Look at those letters. Look at those pages. But you know what? I have to read Chomsky. I have to. I just have to. Okay, this is additional. I'm still at the introduction, and I've gone through the part where it is an additional information for the Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. Vietnam, the title chapter was Vietnam, was the United States a victim or an aggressor? The aggressor, if you did not know your history. The United States is definitely the aggressor. They fund the French. Vietnam was colonized by France for I forgot how many decades, and then I forgot the name of the guy too from Vietnam. Ho Chi Minh. Yeah, Ho Chi Minh started becoming the leader in Vietnam, and then during his leadership moment, World War II happened and Japan came to occupy Vietnam. The French that was there ran from Japan, and so instead the Vietnam is the one who have to fight. The Vietnam who have been occupied for so long by the French was left to be the victim of Japan, but they fought back and they managed to get rid of the Japanese people. And then France, seeing that, hey, there's no more Japanese, I can occupy Vietnam again. Vietnam said, nah. And then France came to attack them, and Vietnam fight back. The one who found the Vietnam to reoccupy, the one who found France to reoccupy Vietnam was United States. 80% of the war fund for France was funded by basically American tax as usual. And then despite being funded by America, France didn't fail to reoccupy Vietnam. And so what United States did, with NATO's help, they separate Vietnam into two, into North and South. The North is being led by Ho Chi Minh, and the South is being led by this dictator that is backed by the United States. The United States then doesn't like the dictator from the South Vietnam, so they took care of him and placed a new leader there. It's so fun being America's ally. That's when Vietnam War happened because of that. Because the United States with NATO split the Vietnam into two. And even then, again, just like how United States funded France, this time they went in and they started a massive bombing campaign, a massive war, so long, killed many of Vietnamese, and still they didn't manage to take Vietnam. North Vietnam win, and to punish them for winning the war against America, because at the time I think America's people also started to realize, hey, I think we're the bad guys here. Can you stop? So America stopped, but what their people didn't know is that America sanctioned and put embargoes on Vietnam trade, so no, they cannot trade with other countries. This is despite them still being on the red, so to say. They have no money because they've just gone through multiple wars with France, with Japan, with France, with America. So they don't have that much money, and they need to rebuild a lot of their cities. And instead of saying, hey, my bad, we've done a lot of bad stuff to you, America punished them with economic embargo. So yeah, America is the aggressor in the Vietnam War. In chapter 5 through 7, he showed that media coverage of the Indochina War fits the propaganda model very well. The United States first intervened in Indochina immediately after World War II in support of French recolonization, after which it carried out a 21-year effort from 1954 to 1975 to impose a government in the southern half of Vietnam that US officials, this is that I mentioned, and analysts consistently recognized as lacking any substantial indigenous support, any opposition to local nationalists. Though communist, forces that were understood to have a mass base, US leaders operated on the belief that their overwhelming military might would not only enable them, but entitle them to force submission to a minority government of US choice. So yeah, when Oslo Accord, I think, if I'm not mistaken, when NATO, America, United States used NATO to split Vietnam into two, most of Vietnamese went to the north because that's the people that wanted Vietnam freedom. And then a few, not just a few, there's a lot, but you know what I mean. Most of the Vietnamese goes to the south, and then the go to the north, and the south doesn't have that many Vietnamese. So the indigenous people is mostly from the north. So America is just basically fighting against the indigenous people as usual. I know now what you said, this should make the US effort in Vietnam a case of aggression. The mainstream media, however, rarely if ever found US policy there to be other than highly moral and well-intentioned, even if based on miscalculation of its cost to us. See Chapter 5. The media readily accepted that we were protecting South Vietnam, a US creation ruled by a dictator imported directly from the United States against somebody else's aggression, facilitating in their identification of the aggressor between North Vietnam, the Soviet Union, China, or the resistance in South Vietnam, and engaging in internal aggression. It is compelling evidence of the propaganda service of the mainstream media that throughout the war, they accept this basic propaganda assumption of the war managers, and from that era up to today, we have never found a mainstream editorial or news report that characterized the US war against Vietnam. Then all of Indochina as a case of aggression. After the United States terminated the military phase of the war in 1975, it maintained and enforced an 18-year boycott of the country that it had virtually destroyed. Yeah, this is what I mean when with the military embargo and the economic sanction and embargo, punishing Vietnam for winning the war. According to Vietnamese estimate, the war had cost them 3 million killed, 300,000 missing, 4.4 million wounded, and 2 million harmed by toxic chemicals, and its land was left ravaged by bombs and round blows, as well as chemical weapons. Yeah, the United States used Agent Orange, a chemical weapon that has now been banned by international law because of how disgusting it is. Vietnam War ended in 1975, and even now in 2025, the Orange Agent that the United States used in Vietnam is still damaging the health of the Vietnamese people in some areas. That is how disgusting that weapon is. And the United States didn't hold back on using them at all. The soldiers that are also using the Agent Orange is also feeling the effect of the bomb, of the chemical weapon itself. But I don't feel that much sorry for them compared to the Vietnamese people, obviously. With 58,000 killed, the US death toll from the war was under 0.1% of its population. Vietnam's death toll was 17% of its population, and only Vietnam peoples were attacked by chemical warfare and had their countryside devastated. Yeah. During the Vietnam War, United States targeted a lot of civilian structure, like hospital, school, but a lot of those didn't go into the mainstream news. Just like how a lot of today, if you see the Palestinian genocide, there's not really any news from mainstream media, or at least even if there is news, it will be downplayed in the headlines. So the important information is usually they use what is called bury the lead, where they put the important information at the end of the article. So, and most people usually only just read until a certain point now in the news because of our attention span. Skip. Nevertheless, US officials and the mainstream media continue to view the US role in the war as creditable, the United States as the victim. President George Bush stated in 1992 that Hanoi knows today that we seek only answers without the threat of retribution for the past. That is, the Vietnamese have done things to us that might justify retribution on our part, but we only seek answers regarding our men missing in action. New York Times Foreign Affairs commentator Leslie Guild justified classifying Vietnam an outlaw on the ground that they had killed Americans. Well, yeah. This reflects the common establishment view implicit in Bush's comment that nobody has the right of self-defense against this country, even if it intervenes across the ocean to impose by force a government that people of that country reject. US chemical warfare in Indochina. It is also of interest how the media have treated the massive use of chemicals during the Vietnam War and the horrifying aftermath for the victim country. In 1961 and 1962, the Kennedy administration authorized the use of chemicals to destroy rice crops in South Vietnam, in violation of a US tradition as well as international law. Admiral William Levy, in response to a proposal to destroy Japanese rice crop in 1944, stated that this would violate every Christian ethic I have ever heard of and all known laws of war. Between 1961 and 1971, however, the US Air Force sprayed 20 million gallons of concentrated arsenic-based dioxin-laden herbicide, mainly Agent Orange, on 6 million acres of crops and trees, besides using large quantities of the super tear gas (CS) and a vast amount of napalm and phosphorus bomb. An estimated 13% of South Vietnam's land was subjected to chemical attacks. This includes 30% of its rubber plantation and 36% of its mangrove forest, along with other large forest areas destroyed by toxic chemicals in programs that included multiple large-scale international efforts combining the evaluation of incendiaries to produce a forest fire in South Vietnam. A 1967 study prepared by the head of the agronomy section of the Japanese Science Council concluded that US anti-crop warfare had already ruined more than 3.8 million acres of arable land in South Vietnam, killing almost 1,000 peasants and over 13,000 livestock. This policy of attempting to force enemy capitulation by destroying its food supply was not only contrary to the rules of war, it was notable in it that it first and overwhelmingly affected small children. Yeah. Oh, hello. Laos was also subjected to chemical attack in 1966 and 1969, directed at both crops and vegetation along communication routes. And in Cambodia, some 173,000 acres of rubber plantation, crops and forests were heavily sprayed with Agent Orange in the spring of 1969. The Cambodian government complained bitterly at the violation of its neutrality by this inhuman and illegal action. But Cambodia was too small and weak for its voice to be heard or for it to be able to mobilize a legal or other defense. Although the UN General Assembly did strongly condemn that use of chemical agents as contrary to international law by an 83-3 vote in 1969, it was powerless to act against the United States and there was no international community mobilization to halt its use of chemical warfare in Cambodia or elsewhere in Indochina. During the Vietnam War, the use of chemicals was reported and criticized in the US media when first disclosed in 1966, but the subject was quickly dropped. The illegality of chemical warfare and a policy of starvation and their effects on the victim population were virtually unreported. There were exceptions, such as Orville Schell Jr. 1961, Look magazine article Silent Vietnam, How We Invented Ecocide and Killed a Country, but they were rare indeed. After the war, because of the effect of Agent Orange on US soldiers, there was some coverage of this chemical warfare campaign, but vastly greater impact on the direct targets of this warfare in South Vietnam remained close to invisible. Of 1,222 articles in the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, Newsweek, and Time during the 1990s that mentioned Agent Orange and Vietnam together, the vast majority focused on the harm done to US service personnel. Only 9 articles acknowledged the targeting of food crops, 39 mentioned forest cover alone as the target, only 11 discussed in any detail the impact on Vietnamese and the Vietnamese environment. Only 3 characterized the use of Agent Orange as a chemical weapon or chemical warfare, and in only 2 articles was it suggested that its use might constitute a war crime. So that's what 1%. That's disgusting. The Wall Street Journal did have a lead history on this topic in February 1997, reporting that as many as 500,000 children may have been born with dioxin-related deformities, and that birth defects in the South were 4 times those in the North. The article did acknowledge US responsibility for this disaster, but contended that the United States, emotionally spent after losing the war, paid no heed. But the United States did pay heed for the flight of the boat people and was not too exhausted to enforce a vigorous boycott of the target of its aggression, even if it took no responsibility whatever for the condition of its victim. Yeah. If they care about the victim of the war that, they started, of their invasion basically, they would not put sanction on Vietnam, because why would you punish the people that you're guilty of? So their excuse that they're too tired to care is false. The large-scale application of chemical weapons and napalm in Vietnam was confined to the South. One reason for this was that North Vietnam had a government with links to other countries, so that the use of this barbarous and illegal weapon against it would have been widely publicized. South Vietnam was occupied by the United States and its client regime, so that the victimized people of the South were voiceless and could be treated with unlimited savagery. This, of course, contradicted the claim that we were protecting them against aggression, but the media not only underplayed the savagery, they failed to call attention to the contradiction and its significance. During the United States staying in South Vietnam to invade all of Vietnam, basically, their soldiers did a lot of sexual assault, rape. A lot of those victims in Vietnam received unfair judgment because they carry the blood of their enemy, blood of the Americans, and also because it was a time when, unfortunately, the society is not kind to victims of sexual assault, sexual abuse. So a lot of them then ran to other countries, including America. Ocean Vuong, one of the most famous poets that came from Vietnam, is one of those cases. He doesn't know who his father it was. because it's one of the American soldiers, one among many of the American soldiers that attacked her. New York Times journalist Barbara Crosset did report that the US failure to get involved in studying the effect of chemical warfare in Vietnam had been unfortunate because as this country had used it heavily in the south but not in the north, this made Vietnam a controlled experiment in the effect of dioxin on humans from which much could be learned of benefit to ourselves. But neither Crosset nor any other mainstream reporter had anything to say about the fact that the United States had used dioxin only on the ones it was allegedly protecting against aggression, nor did they suggest that this constituted a serious war crime, or that this country might have an obligation to help those it had victimized. During the 1980s, the Reagan administration mounted a major propaganda campaign over alleged victims of yellow rain in Cambodia and Laos, claiming that chemical warfare had been employed there by the Soviet Union through its Vietnam proxy. Reagan really did so much imperialism during the Cold War. This propaganda effort eventually collapsed following the US Army own inability to confront this warfare and, more importantly, the finding that the alleged yellow rain had bee feces, not chemicals. Nevertheless, this campaign received vastly more publicity than the real and large-scale chemical warfare carried out by the United States in Indochina. The Wall Street Journal, which had heavily featured yellow rain and expressed the greatest indignation at its display of communist evil, never mentioned the US employment of chemical in that area during its yellow rain campaign. The journal's publisher, Peter Kahn, eventually wrote that the Vietnam War record had clarified who were the good guys and who were the bad guys, deftly shown by the poison field of Laos, his euphemism for yellow rain. In short, Kahn placed the massive real-world use of chemical warfare by the United States in Orwell's black hole and demonstrated communist evil by putting forward the discredited claim of yellow rain that his paper has still not admitted to be fraudulent. But the more important facts are this: that with the help of the media, the Soviet Union was effectively linked to the use of this ugly weapon based on false evidence, while by treating the real and large-scale use of chemical weapons in Indochina by the United States in very low-key up to this very day, the media have helped convey the impression that this country is a moral force on this issue and opposes the use of this terrible weaponry. US leaders have opposed the use of chemical warfare by enemy states, but it is a different matter when they choose to use such weaponry themselves, or when a client state does the same. Oh yeah, Agent Orange and chemical warfare, military invasion to Vietnam, all of those was done by United States. But once everything was finished, because Vietnam was still recovering and also it's a small country compared to America. America is the richest country on earth, even at that time, or maybe even more so at that time. And Vietnam was just a small country, and this was before the internet. So the narrative was changed by the United States media, mainstream media, that it's not them that are doing it, even though everything came from them. America is the one who produces it, America is the one who brings it to Vietnam, and America is the one who uses those chemical warfare in Vietnam. Instead, what they mention in the media, they blame as Soviet. This event is then known as the Red Scare, which is everything that United States did is blamed on communists and Soviet Union, even though the one who did it, the perpetrator, Haniwa Omaida, is America. Let's read some more letters. thanks. I'm doing good too. Placements. In last year, Yeah. Yeah. My mic sounds like a broken record by mentioning Nasdaq's capitalism a lot in my answer to these letters, but that is where we are right now. There's no denying it. So what use is denying it anyway? Denying reality? This is real. S2 campaign request again on the campaign server DM and go DM. staying away from the campaign server. Continue reading. I think we're still the giant war. State invasion as usual. Rewriting Vietnam War history. There have been thousands of books written on the Vietnam War, and that war has been operating on its presence in the US culture since its end in 1975. For the dominant elite, the war represents an era in which resistance to national policy and the associated rise of formerly apathetic sector of society caused a crisis of democracy. Those unruly sectors and dissidents are seen as having damaged the cultural and political framework and imposed unreasonable impediments to the use of force, later referred to as the Vietnam Syndrome. Within the unruly sector and among the dissidents, of course, the 60s are viewed as an era of liberation. of cultural and moral advance, and a temporary source of democratization. The propaganda model would lead us to expect mainstream media retrospective on the war to reflect great perspective. Portraying the 1960s as a dark age and the US role in the war as at worst a case of good intention gone awry. Focusing here on the treatment of the war over the past decade, we see that the media have mainly repeated and elaborated several apologetic themes already entrenched by the end of the war. One thing has been that the US intervention was justified by the fact of communism on the march. Editorial was non-post April 30, 2000. It was argued from the beginning that the communist advance in Vietnam was part of a global communist conspiracy, a position maintained in the face of the split and hostility between China and the Soviet Union. Again, this is more riskier. Tension between China and North Vietnam and the absence of any evidence that North Vietnam was anybody's tool. In his book, in retrospect, former Defense Secretary Robert McNamara, this guy, admits that he and his colleagues made a serious error on this point, but neither he nor the other establishment reporters who have used this argument have ever questioned the US right to intervene by force to stop the march of communism, quote-unquote march of communism, in a country where the communists had led to a nationalist revolution, were recognized by all official and non-official authorities to command the support of a large majority of the population, and where their defeat will require open aggression, mass killing, and the virtual destruction of a distinct society. Closely related was the team that we were protecting South Vietnam and the South Vietnamese, who let the America take over the fighting. Editorial Washington Post. A sub-theme of this line is that we let down the South Vietnamese, but as noted earlier, South Vietnamese as a political entity was a US concoction, and the US war managers recognized that most of the southern population supported the side the United States was fighting. This explains why the main thrust of US violence was directed to the south, where napalm, the bombing raids, chemical warfare, the institutionalized killing of civilians, and a scorched earth policy were used to destroy the base of the popular movement. We also noted earlier that this ferocious US assault on the south, which contradicts the claim that we were protecting South Vietnamese, remains invisible in the US media. Another important thing in the mainstream media for many years has been the notion that the US state was the victim in the Vietnam War, the Vietnamese the cruel villains. This remarkable inversion of reality has been accomplished by two processes. First, by a massive suppression of evidence on the consequences of the war for the Vietnamese, and second, by demonizing the victims, based in large measure on the national beatification of POW, prisoner of war, and the myth of POWs as martyrs still being tortured by Vietnam. The only Vietnamese allowed modest attention in the media have been those mobilized to fight the US war and who were let down. The vast number killed or damaged by US assault have been treated as unworthy victims. Also, there's the narrative of the perfect victims, right? I haven't released the video for it yet, but one of the best book to read about it is 1. Edward Said Orientalism, and 2 is Omar El Akkad's Perfect Victims. So the Western imperialism, or in this case United States, pick and choose which one could be victims, which one could be victims. Like for example, by rewriting history, changing the narrative, and so on and so forth. Vietnam is one of them that is I'm currently reading, and there are other cases like Palestine is the easiest one to use right now because of the current genocide, where they always ask people who supported Palestine, do Israel have the right to exist? Which doesn't make sense, because one, Israel right now is exist as a state and supported by most countries, Western countries, Arab countries, so that their question is bullshit. And two, no, a state doesn't have the right to exist. People have the right to exist, and making people being disappeared, being eradicated, nobody has the right to do those. And Israel is doing that to Palestinians who the media is trying to frame as unworthy victims. And people who they choose to be, who they deem to be worthy victims are also usually being sanitized heavily. Martin Luther King had a lot of involvement with the Black Panther movement, the communist movement, Black communist liberation movement in the United States, because they are also being oppressed there. And Nelson Mandela is also being sanitized heavily to be deemed as worthy victim, as the perfect victim. They didn't tell the story about how Nelson Mandela was inspired to eradicate the apartheid in Africa when he joined the Communist Party of Africa. They didn't tell the story about how Nelson Mandela created armed resistance. I forgot the name. Umkolo Umbabwe, if I'm not mistaken, and I don't even know if I spelled that right. But yeah, he made an armed resistance, just like, you know, Fatah, Hamas, Houthi. There's the other big one from Lebanon. But yeah, Nelson Mandela, like them, created armed resistance against the apartheid. And then the US designated him personally as a terrorist. And then they captured him. And they tried every year to make him denounce armed resistance, and he kept refusing, so his sentence in prison got prolonged over and over again until he was in prison for a total of 27 years. That's how people got the Mandela effect, where a lot of people just talk that Mandela is dead because that he spent so much time in prison, 27 years. Most of the liberation of Africa from apartheid doesn't have anything to do with personally with Nelson Mandela's involvement. He just started the movement and then everyone else finished it. So they don't tell a lot of those stories to make it so that Nelson Mandela can become a worthy victim, because they didn't do a lot of the things that they hate. He's not part of the communist movement, he's not part of armed resistance, you know, all the things that they are right now attacking Palestinian for, at least in the media, the justification for it. That's what the book means by unworthy victims. The overwhelming preoccupation of officials, journalists, pundits, and intellectuals with media outrage has been on US victims and the effects of the war on this country. Robert McNamara's widely publicized book, supposedly a mea culpa and moral tract, is notable for the fact that his notion of the war high cost and the error and guilt he feels extend only to US lives and the effect of the war on the political unity of our society. He offers neither regret, moral reflection, nor apologies for his country having invaded, mercilessly bombed, ravaged the land, and killed and wounded millions of innocent people in a small distant peasant society in pursuit of its own political ends. In a remarkable cultural process, also, the victim has been turned into the villains, as we described in Chapter 5. In an attempt to prolong the war, President Richard Nixon seized on the question of the adequacy of Vietnamese accounting for military personnel who were captured, POWs, and those missing in action, MIAs. He succeeded in keeping the war going, and some 16,000 more US soldiers and untold number of Vietnamese died in the further fighting in the purported interest of missing POWs. But although there has never been any credible evidence that a single POW was hidden by the North Vietnamese, this claim became an article of faith and cult that dominated US policy toward Vietnam for many years. The myth also became the basis of popular cultural accounts in movies such as The Deer Hunter, Uncommon Valor, POW The Escape, and Missing in Action, in which rainbow-like heroes slaughter evil Vietnamese as they save or betray and tormented POWs. This movie turned history on its head, as Vietnam War historian S. Bruce Franklin points out. America's vision of the war was being transformed. The actual photographs and TV footage of massacred villagers, napalm children, Vietnamese prisoners being tortured and murdered, wounded GIs screaming in agony, and body bags being loaded by the dozens for shipment back home were being replaced by simulated images of American POWs in the savage hand of Asian communists. The powerful cultural myth of abused POWs as the central feature of the Vietnam War not only allowed the war to be extended, it helped justify the US failure to aid its victim in accord with end-of-war promises, and it provided the basis for an 18-year economic warfare against the victim country. It also functioned as a potent agent of militarization and force weakening the Vietnam syndrome. 18-year economic war. The embargo and sanctions that I mentioned that prevent Vietnam for trading with other countries, and they also freeze the asset of every South Vietnamese. So if South Vietnamese had a bank account in foreign countries, they were being freezed. So they cannot take that money that belong to them. It's like if you go to the bank and then you say, "Hey, why can't I take my money?" And then they just said, "We don't allow you to." That's what happened. In his recent book, Vietnam and Other American Fantasies, it's Bruce Franklin, who had previously exposed the fallacies and qualities of the POW/MIA myth, addressed this issue once again, as well as other fantasies such as the claim that the anti-war activists often spit at returning veterans. Franklin's book was reviewed in the Los Angeles Times but was otherwise only twice mentioned in passing in the US mainstream press. On the other hand, a book by Michael Lynn, Vietnam: The Necessary War, which explained that the war was justifiable because communism was on the march, US credibility was at stake, and the Vietnamese communists were cruel and ruthless, demonstrated in part by their refusal to surrender and consequent responsibilities for those killed by US bombs, while it was treated differently. It received 44 reviews and was mentioned 27 other times in mainstream media, and Lin was given op-ed space in both the New York Times and the Washington Post, among other opportunities. In his review of Lin's book, Vietnam War historian Lloyd Gardner noted that any US credibility problem that arose in connection with the Vietnam War was a creation of the war managers themselves and flowed from their own decisions. And Gardner also comments, after analyzing a series of Lin arguments in defense of the war, that the evidence simply washes away his position like a sandcastle on the beach. But Lin was saying what the elite once said, and Franklin was not, so that mainstream media treatment followed accordingly. That's why around the world during the Cold War, including in Indonesia, communism become a bad, evil war is because the United States propaganda machine, which is their mainstream media, was spreading those messages instead of, the truth that the United States is the bad guys in most of these cases, and a lot of other cases too. I think they're also still doing this, right? Again, with the Palestinian, for example. BBC tried to block the documentary about I forgot the name of the documentary. Is it Doctor in Gaza or Doctor in Palestine? Documentary block by BBC. Okay, yeah, Gaza Doctors Under Attack. And people. That's my first for a bit. all just wanted to get in the feeling, in their feeling, you know. Which can be valid for a lot of the time, but if you do it over and over again and extend that emotion, it's not good for you or even for the person that you care about. It's just not good. Maybe one more letter, then I want to go pee, then I'll continue reading the book. Take a pee break, and then I'll continue with the manufacturing console. Thanks, I guess. I'm back. What did I miss? Nothing? plain of Jar was subjected to some of the heaviest bombing of civilian targets in history, especially after 1968, when Washington was compelled under domestic pressure to enter negotiations with North Vietnam and help to terminate its bombing debt. It turned to Laos, although that small peasant country was a marginal factor in the wars, but Nixon and Kissinger could hardly leave US bombers inactive. Overall, the military-industrial complex is also a big part of the reason why US kept going to war, even having to do it through other countries' proxy wars, right? That's why they kept funding Israel, that's why they kept funding other countries like Ukraine. It's because they make a lot of money, and the industry or the industries of the war manufacturer also make a lot of money as long as US kept involving itself into war. And most of those wars had no justification, had no moral justification for it at least. They tried to justify a lot of it, which is why the term manufacturing consent come from. These raids wiped out 353 villages and killed thousands of civilians, and they continue to kill now, as the plain was saturated with hundreds of millions of bombies, tiny anti-personnel weapons specifically designed to kill and maim. With a 20 to 30% failure to explode rate, they remain as potential killers, and their casualty rate is still high, estimates running from 100 to 20,000 or more per year. Half of them deaths and half of the victims children. There have been efforts to deal with this humanitarian catastrophe. The British-based Mines Advisory Group (MAG) has been trying to remove the lethal object, but the British press report that the United States is conspicuously missing from the handful of Western organizations that have followed MAG. Though it has finally agreed to train some Laotian civilians, the British press also reports with some annoyance that the United States has refused to provide MEC specialists with rather harmless procedures, still treated as a state secret for weapons 3 decades old. The US mainstream media have treated in a very low key the continuing human toll suffered in Laos, and have maintained almost complete silence concerning the US non-cooperativeness in attempts to alleviate a crisis dating back to the secret war against Laos, which again was secret only by tacit propaganda service of the mainstream media. Cambodia. Important changes have occurred in Cambodia since 1988, including Vietnam's withdrawal from that country, election held under UN auspices, and the death of Pol Pot. We noted in Chapter 7 that after the Vietnamese had ousted Pol Pot in December 1978, although the United States and its allies had denounced Pol Pot as another Hitler committing genocide, they quickly became his supporter, allowing him to retain Cambodia's UN seat and otherwise aiding and protecting him in his Thailand refugee. Vietnam was severely punished by harsh sanctions and by US support for a Chinese invasion to teach Vietnam a lesson. But having terminated Pol Pot atrocities, President Carter's National Security Advisor Zbigniew Brzezinski stated in 1979 that I encouraged the Chinese to support Pol Pot. I encouraged the Thai to help PJ democratic Cambodia Pol Pot's wars. Pol Pot was not Polynesian, could never support him, but China could. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, as the Vietnamese sought to end their isolation by exiting from Cambodia, but insisted as a condition for withdrawal that Pol Pot and his Khmer Rouge be excluded from returning to power. The United States objected and insisted with eventual success that the Khmer Rouge be included as a contestant party in the post-occupation settlement. What dominated US policy and led to the support of Pol Pot was the classic rule that the enemy of my enemy, Vietnam, is my friend, and perhaps also the New Deal toward China also hostile toward Vietnam. The support of Pol Pot was awkward given the prior denunciation of his policy. but the mainstream media handled it with aplomb, and the US public was almost surely completely unaware that the United States had become his ally and supporter. The explicit statement of support by Brzezinski quoted above was never mentioned in the New York Times, the Washington Post, or Newsweek. It was quoted once in both the Los Angeles Times and Time. However, in the late 1990s, after Vietnam had left Cambodia and US official anti-Vietnam passion had subsided and Pol Pot was no longer a useful instrument of anti-Vietnam policy, US official and pundits rediscovered Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge villainy and candidacy for war crimes trial. The media handled the previous tilt toward Pol Pot mainly by evasion, essentially blacking out the years 1979 to 95, or vaguely intimating that the US had supported him for reasons of realpolitik, but avoiding both details on the nature and magnitude of support as well as any reflection on the morality of backing another Hitler. The New York Times support summary of Pol Pot's rise and fall, April 17, 1998. Days for 1979 to 1990, Pol Pot and Khmer Rouge are given refuge at Thai border where they fight back against the Vietnamese. Given refuge is misleading. They are given economic and military aid and political support by the United States and its allies. The Times' main reporter on Cambodia in early 1998 said Meadans repeatedly blacked out mention of US support, referring to the decade-long civil war that followed Pol Pot's ouster, April 13, and a 19-year guerrilla insurgency in the jungles of western and northern Cambodia, April 17. The Boston Globe, New York Times, Washington Post, and Los Angeles Times, editorializing of the death of Pol Pot on April 17, 1998, were uniformly indignant over his crimes and regretful at his escape from justice, but all avoided mentioning the long US support of the criminal, as well as the US contribution to the first phase of a decade of genocide. The Washington Post blacked out the inconvenient 15-year period of support of Pol Pot with the summary. After the nightmare of Khmer Rouge rule and genocide, the United States and its allies pumped millions of dollars into Cambodia to help rebuild and to hold elections. It is enlightening to compare the media treatment of Pol Pot and Indonesian leader Suharto, who was also in the news in 1998, as Indonesia suffered a financial crisis that, along with popular resistance to the dictatorship, eventually led to his ouster. Pol Pot was described in the editorial and news column of April 1998 as crazy, a killer, war criminal, mass murderer, black soap, and as having engineered a reign of terror and genocide. But in 1998 and 1999, and in earlier years as well, while Suharto was occasionally referred to as a dictator and running an authoritarian regime, he was never a killer or mass murderer or one responsible for genocide. The terminological double standard is maintained reliably throughout the mainstream media. Less obvious but equally interesting is the difference in willingness to identify the responsible parties for the killing of Pol Pot and Suharto. In the case of Pol Pot, there is no uncertainty or complexity. Editorials and news articles uniformly make him and the Khmer Rouge leadership clearly and unambiguously responsible for all death in Cambodia during the period 1975 to 78. He was the man who slaughtered 2 million, the executioner who presided over the deaths of his victims, the man who drove Cambodia to ruin. But in Suharto's case, we move to an ambiguous responsibility, which means none at all. In the New York Times, for example, 1965 book led to the massacre of hundreds of thousands supposed communists, where we have no agents doing the killing, a wave of violence that took up to 500,000 lives and led Suharto to seize power from Sukarno in a military coup, where the massacre not only has no agent but is falsely situated before the takeover of power by Suharto. In a later piece, Maidan suggests that more than 500,000 Indonesians are estimated to have died in the purge of leftists in 1965, the year Mr. Suharto came to power. Not the passive voice, never used in connection with Pol Pot, the word purge instead of slaughter or massacre, and the continued failure to identify the agent. In the case of East Timor, also the times is uncertain about the source of the killing. This is one of the worst shattered places, where 100,000 to 200,000 people died from 1974 in a brutal civil war and the consequent invasion through combat, execution, disease, and starvation. In addition to the lack of a clear region, this sentence seriously misrepresenting the fact the civil war was short and left small numbers dead, and the invasion was not consequent to a brutal civil war except in Indonesian propaganda. Another important difference in the treatment of the worthy victims of Pol Pot and the unworthy victims of Suharto is in the willingness to explain away the killings. With Pol Pot, as we described in Chapter 7, the background of the first phase of the genocide was completely blacked out in a mainstream account. There is no qualification to Pol Pot's responsibility as a killer because his forces had undergone terrible damage and sought vengeance for the crimes they had suffered. Nor are any deaths in Pol Pot's years of rule to be explained by the starvation and disease already pervasive in April 1975. No, the only mentionable background is his Paris training and communist fanaticism. But with Suharto, we encounter a whole new world of contextualized apologetics. For many years, the main protective formula was that the 1965 to 66 killings were a result of a failed coup, which thought of a way for violence, or followed an onslaught from the left. This formula invokes repeatedly suggests that the mass killings were provoked and thus may be justified by a prior onslaught. The writer never explained why a failed coup could possibly justify a large-scale slaughter, but the hymn is left hanging. Yeah, they don't finish. They don't give any reason, they just give you some context, leading context. Suharto has blocked these gains by maintaining a tight grip on power and suppressing public criticism and public political opposition. His statements from the New York Times offer a kind of context that the paper never gives to Castro, let alone a Pol Pot, and it shows an apologetic that runs deep. This apologetic extends to the Suharto invasion and occupation of East Timor. For years, New York Times reporters have claimed that Indonesia invaded in the midst of a civil war, when in fact that civil war was over well before the invasion. The paper's new coverage of East Timor actually fell to zero as the Indonesian attack and killing in East Timor reached a peak in 1976 to 78. A slaughter that elsewhere would be called genocidal, although Indonesia occupied East Timor in violation of 10 million Rawlings village Indus exit in 1999. Reporters repeatedly referred to East Timor as a disputed province and East Timor's resistance as separatists, thereby internalizing and explicitly legitimizing the oppression and occupation. And general treatment of Suharto in the Indonesian government in the media is once again correlated with US policy support that dates back to the military coup and slaughters of 1965. These were greeted with enthusiasm by US officials and Secretary of Defense. Secretary of Defense Robert McNamara referred to the event as one of the dividends of US support for the Indonesian military and the boiling bloodbath and staggering mass slaughter. Were also seen in the media as a gleam of light. US military and economic aid and diplomatic protection continued throughout the years of the Suharto dictatorship, and the media finding him a good genocidist followed accordingly. New York Times reported David Sanger differentiated Suharto and post-1990s Saddam Hussein. Before 1990s, he was a US ally, saying Mr. Suharto is not hurting anthrax or threatening to invade Australia. That is, Suharto's invasion, mass killing, and non-illegal occupation of East Timor is given zero weight, and the slaughter of somewhere between 500,000 and 2 million people in Indonesia some years back is also not mentioned. This tells us that all we need to know about how good and bad genocide is fair in the Western propaganda system. Yeah, Indonesia under Suharto killed so many people. Well, I guess not just under Suharto, because of Papua, right? Most of Indonesia's presidents are war crimes because of that. Unfortunate. I'm getting extra tired now because of the lack of sleep and all the works. And tomorrow I also have a meeting early in the morning. So let's answer a few more later. And then I'll end the stream. Okay. That's all I have. LTS Band 7 right? Speaking and writing are terrible. It's hard to think of word right now, which is ironic because like I'm trying to give advice to people, to someone trying to reach a new English level. It's the second one. I kept falling asleep because how tired I am. It's the last letter, and then after that I have to rest. Unfortunately, yeah, a lot of people problem is just this can be boiled down to capitalism, like also this is also imperialism, economic imperialism. But yeah, I think that's about it for the stream. I hope that I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I read the book clear enough. I hope I explained some of the events clear enough. And I hope some of these people can get some help from these letters. Some of it sounds very rough. Some of it is needed some of it needed much more effort to solve it, because one of the book that I'm reading is one of the reasons why it needed so much effort, because the established ruling power wanted to keep it as it is, keep the status quo as it is, because they get much more benefit from that with this system, right? While we have to deal with having multiple jobs just to be able to live. And with that depressing end note, I'll end the stream. You can still find some happiness despite all the struggle. Okay, at least I believe so. Thank you guys for watching. Okay. Let's see what else I can sing. I've been looking at this game called Keep Driving, which looks really good. So I might bought that despite it still being new, and then I'll stream it. Anyway, see you guys next time, okay?